All right, welcome back to Rad Reads. This is a podcast about books that are rad. I'm your host, Kaylena and I'm here again with the Rad Reverend, Timothy Radcliffe.
Hello?
Hello. And today we're going to tackle a topic that kind of comes around a lot on social media, and it's making the round again. Of course, I just threw fuel on the fire today. I
Yep.
threw it out on X today, and this is what I said. I'll read my post. Give me your hottest takes about whether or not listening to audiobooks counts as reading. And so
Yeah.
we got a few good responses. I'll read one of them. Distant Warrior says you have to at least be actively listening to the audiobook more than you are doing another activity. The only activity I can think of that lets you listen to an audiobook is driving or biking. Another person says, Ordo Amoris says, it's the oldest form of storytelling. AC Cargill says, of course listening is not reading. It goes without saying, ears versus eyes. Maybe this discussion should be framed another way. Another person says, no, listening isn't reading, and audiobooks will be better if people treat them as a unique experience.
Mm.
Other questions include, what does it mean to read? What does it mean to listen? Another person says, this is Rachel. She says, it definitely counts as reading in the definition that you are consuming a book. It is ableist to say otherwise. And every time someone tweets stuff like this at all it does is bring out weird people wanting to have a little ableism as a treat.
Yeah.
And then I think Katie Room had the most balanced take. She says, my biggest point of distinction is the insertion of an additional person between the author and the reader who is capable of changing the understanding of the story conveyed. I won't read her whole tweet. You can read it on Twitter. But she says, I'd never fault someone for saying shorthand that they've read the book in casual conversation, but I think it is good to make the clarification in certain situations.
Yeah.
And Michael Caine says, for the purpose of polite conversation, it's not really worth fighting over. It's different, obviously, but not enough for the discourse to be worth the effort. So those are just a few.
Yeah.
So if X is an indication, there's a lot of strong opinions concerning whether listening to audiobooks counts as reading. So first question, why do you think people feel so strongly about it?
There's a part of me that thinks that people feel so strongly about it because online you get to feel very strongly about pretty much anything. So part of me wonders if some of the reason that people feel so strongly is just because you're allowed to online take a position and defend it like there's no tomorrow. But I think that in large part, though, I think it's because people have had such different experiences in the way that they have learned, in the way that they have grown up, the way that they have been taught. And so because of that, they think, well, not that everybody's doing this on purpose, but in some sense, you start to think that the way that you were taught and the way that you have come to conclusions is the same way that everybody else has been taught, the same way that everybody else has come to conclusions. And so, of course, you must have the right view because that's how you were taught. And so, if you were not a good reader when you were younger, you're going to probably fall into the camp of saying, of course, listening is reading because that's the way that I learn and it's easier for me. If you're somebody that grew up reading a lot, you might say, well, no, it's not reading because that would then devalue your childhood and your experiences because you put in that work and you did all of that work. So I think there's a lot of it has to do with just kind of where you're coming from, what your history is, what your background is, with how you've learned and the things that you have experienced and the things that you've done in your own life. And we all, as humans, want to see ourselves as being normal. And so I think that's probably where a lot of those really strong feelings come from.
Mm. Yeah, I think my take on that is a little less articulate. One thing I would say is I think it feels like cheating for me personally.
Sure.
Like, you
Sure.
know, and maybe people who are more upset about it is like, no, you are actually cheating. It's not reading, right? So there's that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's important, reading does require different senses than your sense
That's
of
right.
hearing.
That's
You're
right.
involving a different sense, seeing
Yeah.
and understanding, right?
Yeah.
I also think too, listening can be passive in a way that reading isn't. And we this was something that had come up, I think, recently on Book Talk or whatever, where you had all these people who are saying they're reading like 250 books a year, and what they're
Right.
actually doing is listening to audiobooks at like double speed.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
saying, yeah, I've gotten the gist of it. And so that counts as reading, right? And so I think obviously that
Sure.
would rankle, rankles me, like, you're not understanding.
Yeah.
And somebody had posted about that and said something really interesting, like, oh, this girl, or somebody I knew was reading, and she's like, I was listening to GK Chesterton, but I didn't really get it. But like, she was listening to it at double speed. And
Yeah.
so how do you don't get Chesterton by like listening to it as casual conversation? You actually have to
Correct.
see it.
Correct.
Um,
Yeah, there's a big difference in how we go about consuming things, in how we go about learning things, and yeah, when you're not paying close attention, or when you're listening to something too fast for your brain to keep up with, you're not going to be able to get it. And so some things I think maybe lend themselves to being listened to,
mhm,
and getting just as much out of, and other things you probably say, you're probably not going to get as much out of this as you would if you sat with it and thought about it, slowly working your way through it. And again, you had brought up one of the tweets that talked about the way that we think about other people and the way that we treat other people, and even ableism. And I want to kind of say here, right now I'm talking really mostly in generalities. I'm
mhm.
not really talking specifically about people who need that accessibility. I think for people who need that accessibility, it absolutely counts
Right.
as reading because you're learning information in the way that you can learn it. Really, primarily, we're talking here. I think I'm agreeing with you. We're kind of talking about people who have the ability to read but choose not to and choose to listen instead.
Mhm.
And that's where this kind of becomes more of a debate. When we're talking about an accessibility issue, it's not really a debate. Yes, it's wonderful that people can access books in this way, but really where it becomes a debate, and is it right or wrong, or how should you, is
Right.
people who have the ability to do either, and what they choose to do with those mediums.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. So I think part of that is talking about just like, how do we define reading really? So
Yeah.
is it just comprehension of the story, or does literacy actually mean something different than, that sort of comprehension, or is it the mode of comprehension? Does that matter?
Mm.
So actually I looked it up, and the traditional definition of literacy is just this. It's the ability to read and write. However,
Yeah.
the definition of literacy has been expanded in recent years. So the site UNESCO says literacy is a continuum of learning and proficiency in reading, writing, and using numbers throughout life, and is part of a larger set of skills, which includes digital skills, media literacy,
Yeah.
education for sustainable development, and global citizenship.
Mhm.
And then it says literacy skills themselves are expanding and evolving as people engage more and more with information
Right.
through technology.
Right.
So technology changes things, right?
It's a big deal. We're both millennials, so we maybe feel this at times. People assume that we are computer literate. I don't read computer manuals, but I have people that are older than me, and I have people that are younger than me ask me how to do things on the computer, and I go,
Right.
I don't know, but you just kind of click around and you just figure it out, and you make it work. That is, the term for that is literacy with
Yeah.
computers. I am computer literate, even though I don't read physical media about computers. So
Mhm.
that there has been a shift, and a change in kind of the way that we even understand what it means to be literate. It means to be able to do something or to be able to learn something.
Mhm.
Um, Really, that definition has really broadened out a lot recently.
Yeah. So I also looked up another definition. National Literacy Trust says the word literacy is defined as the ability to read, write, speak, and listen in a way that lets us communicate effectively and make sense of the world. Um, so I think, yeah, that definition kind of encompasses that. It encompasses the idea of knowing, figuring out how to navigate, figuring out how to communicate. So yeah, that's interesting. Now, my question for you: do you think this is a fair definition of literacy or of reading? Yeah.
You know me, and people that know me know this. I have a fondness for words, and I think that words have very specific meaning, and I think that we need to take into account what the author's intent is
Mhm.
when we are hearing or when we are reading. So when we're talking about words, I don't love the idea, but I understand how language works, but I don't love the idea of expanding definitions to be totally inclusive for every word, right? I'm not saying that I don't want to be inclusive toward people and toward people that don't have the same abilities as others, but words themselves ought to have meaning and ought
Right.
to have definition. And so when I think about the word reading, to me, that has traditionally and historically meant something. And what it has meant is looking at words that are uh, put down, and I'm not even going to say on paper, right? Because people used to write without paper. Looking at symbols on paper and understanding what those symbols mean. That's really what reading is. Now, again, that is going to then evolve as language evolves, and
Right.
language is always changing and moving. But traditionally, that's the meaning of the word read. But in this sense, I start to go, okay, yeah, I think that we can't become so rigid in our words that we can't start to go, but we kind of know what we mean when we say that.
Mhm.
If I say that I read a book, yeah, that probably indicates that I have looked at the words on the pages and understood it that way. But at the same time, you can read something, you can comprehend something by hearing it, and
Mhm.
that actually has a longer tradition in human history. To hear stories and to understand and to be able to communicate, you know, would we say that that's reading? I think probably I would prefer a technical definition of reading as looking at something that's written down, and comprehending as involving both writing and audio.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think it's a really good point that you bring up. So we can say, like, by the barest definition, reading is a different thing than listening, but it's not a lesser thing when it comes to comprehension, when
Right.
it comes to, in the broader sense of literacy, of understanding. And you brought up the example of y- cultures across the world historically have not been literate in that sense, but they've had plenty of story that has been passed down, oral storytelling traditions,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
are also incredibly structured. You just think of Beowulf. That's an
Yeah.
epic poem, and
Absolutely.
it's long, and it was made to be transmissible, made to be able to remember and
Mhm.
metered. um so you're passing down the actual words. And there's other examples: the Odyssey, the
Yeah.
Iliad. We talk about psalms,
Uh,
creeds, and
yeah.
catechisms. Yeah, so yeah, you have plenty of.
I mean, you're right. That's exactly in my wheelhouse. This is how we know the stories from the original audience of the Bible.
Mhm.
The original audience of the Bible told these things and transmitted them orally before they were written down. Many of them, and some of them, most people that did not have a physical copy of the Bible in front
Right.
of them, and so the only way that they knew what they were supposed to believe is when they heard it read. They had to remember what was said. They didn't read it for themselves. And we don't want to take away anything from those people and say, well, you didn't read the
Mhm.
Bible, so you don't understand it. No, they heard it and they were able to believe. So comprehending comes in many different ways. Communication happens in many different ways. And so even if we have a tighter definition of what reading is, that doesn't take away from our ability to understand and communicate and comprehend story.
Mhm. And I would say too, just something I thought of is, and it also works kind of the inverse, where things are meant to be heard, not just read. So, for example, Shakespeare. When I was an English literature major, right, and we always read Shakespeare, but it wasn't really until we performed it and we read it out loud and we had the stage directions, we saw what was happening, and we're like, okay, this is a story that needs to be told and heard for you to really truly understand it. And I think you had told me Orson Scott Card when he had written
Yes.
Ender's Game. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I listened to the audiobook of Ender's Game. So I guess by my own definition, I didn't read it, but I listened to it. And there's an interview with Orson Scott Card at the end of the audiobook where he talks about he was originally a playwright, And so he originally wrote for it to be performed. And when he wrote this novel, he said he never really felt like it was complete as a novel. And so when it was read, and it was read dramatically by several different performers on this audiobook, he said in his mind, that is the pinnacle. That is the best version of Ender's Game, is listening to it read by people who took his direction and read it the way that he wanted it to be expressed. So in his mind, the best way to consume his novel is to listen to the audiobook that he wanted to be recorded. So yeah, even in a circle like that, you can say there are times where it is meant to be heard. It is meant to be voiced. And sometimes we can lose some with some things. You talked about poetry, you talked about plays, or Orson Scott Card's novel Ender's Game, and you lose something when you only hear it in your own voice.
Right.
So that absolutely can happen. But to the point that was made by one of the tweets that you had mentioned earlier, there is also a potential possibility for misunderstanding or for lack of clarity when you add another person in. The way that I read a book might be a little bit different than the emphasis that somebody who is reading it out loud puts on it, but that would color the way that I understand that passage. One of the classic examples that I have of that is Lord of the Rings. We talked about this in our first podcast. I've read Lord of the Rings 6 or 7 times on my own, and I've also listened to it probably a dozen times, read by Robert Inglis. And the way that I read the book the first couple of times is slightly different than the way that Robert Inglis read it. And who is right in their understanding of which emphasis, which word to put emphasis on, or how a character sounded. Well, that is there. It can complicate it when you start to add in things that were maybe not meant to be read out loud. You can start to kind of add that in when you're not getting the direct from the author emphasis.
This is remind me. So I listened to Dune. I didn't read it. I listened to the audiobook that I got from the library, and they had done it half where they had like dramatic voices, and then they did like half that's just a guy reading it, and it was so jarring to try to figure that out. And then but I'm like, he's supposed to sound like this, so then I had to like do that in my head. And then the other thing I was thinking about too when you talk about like interpretation, and one of the things, especially when you're reading fantasy and there's words that like we wouldn't recognize necessarily or know how to pronounce, and then they pronounce it a certain way and you're like, oh, okay, that's how you say that word. I never even thought about that.
Yeah. I tend, so, in talking about audiobooks, the reason that we're probably talking about this is not just so that everybody can hear our opinion on audiobooks. It's because I listen to a ton of audiobooks.
Right.
Now, I also read a lot, of physical books. So I do both all the time, and I find that I read some books, some styles of books, and other books styles I prefer to listen to. And so I enjoy listening to fiction. I enjoy listening to fantasy because when I read, I feel almost the opposite, where I say when I read fantasy, I don't know how I'm supposed to say those words, and I almost feel not self-conscious totally, but I almost feel a little bit like, am I missing something? Like, I don't know how this is supposed to be said. I don't know what it's supposed to sound like. I don't know what this accent that's being described is actually supposed to sound like. And I feel like I missed something when the people that are under the direction, often of the author, most of the authors that I have listened to the audiobooks are still alive. Not all of them, but most of them are. And so when I listen to fantasy, I go, oh, this is what it's supposed to sound like. This is what that language is supposed to sound like. This is what that name is supposed to sound like. That's how it's supposed to sound. And so I actually appreciate listening to fantasy because I'm not getting in the way of the story that the author is trying to tell me. It's being told to me the way that it's supposed to sound and the way that I'm supposed to hear it.
That's a really good point. Yeah. Was it one example that I could think of where that was a problem? I listened to, when we had the Audible subscription, I listened to all the Witcher books. And in the first couple books, so the character is Dandelion, right?
Yeah.
the bard, and he called in the first couple of books, he called him Dandelion. So, and I hadn't seen it on the page, so I didn't realize it was just the word dandelion.
Yeah.
Um, and there
But
was,
but then you could tell as well in those recordings that after a certain point, when they had made the video
yeah,
games and he was called Dandelion in the video games, he switched and started calling him by that because by then the video games had become more popular than the audiobooks.
and everybody was like,
Yeah.
"Who are you talking about? This Dandelion."
Yeah, yeah. That was a tough one.
It
And
was fun.
there are always problems with any media. I mean, audiobooks.
Yeah,
Most of the audiobooks that I listen to are done very well. Every now and then you get a repeated phrase because the editing wasn't
yeah,
perfect, or sometimes you get weird pauses or weird breaks. I was telling you, I've been listening to the Wheel of Time series since we last recorded our
right.
podcast. Been listening to the Wheel of Time, and there are so many characters that are written about, and that you hear chapters from their perspective. That when I hear it, and when I get to the end of the chapter, all of a sudden I go, oh wait, I have no idea now whose perspective I'm supposed to be
Mhm.
reading from, and it is a little bit jarring to go. I don't know what to expect. I don't when the next chapter starts. I have no idea whose perspective I'm supposed to be in. And sometimes it takes a little while to get there, especially if you have characters whose names sound similar. They
Mhm.
might look different on the page, but they sound similar in the way they're pronounced. And then I go, wait a second, who am I supposed to be thinking about right now? So there are potential difficulties and problems that come from listening to an audiobook. So I love consuming written media and audio
Yeah.
media. I love consuming them both, but I tend to, for deeper things, for heavier things, for more important things, I tend to prefer to read them on a page. But for things that are just more for fun or for my own enjoyment, I like to listen to them because I will listen to it at the gym. I'll listen to it while I'm mowing the lawn. I'll listen to it while I'm taking walks. And that to me, I'm doing two things at the same time. I'm learning something and I'm doing whatever chores I have to be doing. So I enjoy it, but there are times where I say, okay, this would be better served in written media.
No, and you bring up a couple of things I wanted to touch on. So you talked about like when you're listening and you can hear kind of some of the problems. And actually, as a writer, it's something that we're always told to do is like, well, read your work out loud to make sure,
Mm-hmm.
a repeated phrase that you wouldn't notice on the page a couple paragraphs
Yeah,
later, like it
yeah,
makes you can hear it when you read it out loud, or, you know, being able to understand what your characters are saying or doing or who they are. Like sometimes you don't even see it unless you read it
yeah,
out
yeah.
loud.
And I'll tell you, I don't want to upset anyone or ruin anything for anyone. But if you listen to the audiobooks of The Lord of the Rings, you will realize just how often J.R.R. Tolkien said "presently" to describe what was happening right now.
Yep. Yeah. And I think it's funny you talked about how you like to listen to fiction when you're and that's but you prefer to read the heavier stuff. And I don't know that I'm completely opposite, but I think a lot of times I'm grab it when I'm listening, when I'm using audiobooks, I'm listening to information that I'm trying to consume more. Like so I'll listen to histories, I'll listen to certain like theology devotional books. Like I listen to The Four Loves by C.S.
Mm,
Lewis. I listened to Knowing God by J.I. Packer, and it's because I wanted for me, I was gonna have more time to think about it while I was doing something innocuous. Usually it was driving. I wouldn't be able
yeah,
to listen to
yeah,
it, like, when we're walking around the house and the kids keep talking to me, which you do that.
yeah,
But but if I'm doing something for like a long repetitive task, this is something for my brain to do. Now, when I'm reading, I think I really prefer to read a lot of the fantasy or the fiction that I'm reading because I can fill in all those gaps myself without the intermediary, and I prefer to do that. So,
yeah. And I think this is where to bring it all the way back to the beginning when we talked about it has to count as reading because we don't want to be ableist. I say this is why this is an important conversation. It's something to talk about, but it's not something for us to get kind of bent out of shape
yeah.
about because people learn in different ways. Now, I understand that it's kind of pseudoscience to say I'm a visual learner or I'm a an auditory learner. That's not maybe real science, but but there is something, we do have different experiences and we learn in different ways. So, and I mean, I'll admit it, it's a privilege. It's a privilege that part of my job is reading physical media for my job. And so that's the stuff that I read physically. When I'm not physically reading that for my job or for my studies, I go, okay, now let me do something other than what I was just doing for my job and my schooling, because it is not as much fun for me to then do the same thing that I was just doing for work. So I will often listen to things for fun because I can make that choice. I read for work, I read for school, and then I listen for fun. And so because I have the privilege of being able to do both, I enjoy doing both.
Yeah. Yeah. There's people, I know people who I think will be listening to this podcast that I know that, their job requires them to not, they can't sit and read during their job, but they can
Right.
listen to something. And so
Right.
they are learning and growing listening to audiobooks. And, one of the things that I have wanted to do, have aspired to do, is get some of my stuff recorded, because I know there's people who like can't sit down and read my books for whatever reason. But want to know the story. And I'm like, I'm not going to be like, no, you don't get to enjoy it because I just wrote it, or whatever. But
Right.
I'd like it to be in various forms so that you can enjoy the story and you would be able to comprehend the story and know it. So yeah. Um, yeah, I guess we talked about the pros of audiobooks, the cons. So do we have a verdict? Does it count as here's the rule of thumb.
Yeah.
Would
Yeah.
you add it to your Goodreads if you listen to it?
So I have a Goodreads and I add all of my books to Goodreads. I look for, now this is something that I do because I'm pedantic. I look for the audiobook so that I can rate the audiobook that I have listened to on Goodreads. So because I can add audiobooks on Goodreads, I add the audiobooks that I've listened to as audiobooks. Usually. There's sometimes where I get a little bit lazy and I just go, whatever, this is the book, I'll just add it. But I usually will add the books that I have listened to as an audiobook on there. Now, most people aren't going to see that very small distinction, but I know it's there. So
I didn't even know that there was an option to do that. Now, okay, but like if you've got your Goodreads goal, does it all count towards your Goodreads goal?
It all counts towards your Goodreads goal.
That's
yes.
really what matters.
And it counts towards my Goodreads goal. It has to. Yeah. Yeah. So how many stories have I read this year? I'll tell you, I would not have the time to read. I've read 4.5 books of The Wheel of Time in the last month by listening to them.
Yeah.
I do not have the time to read those books because I'm often driving and I'm often going places. I'm often doing chores. And those chores need to get done, right? Like I have to mow the lawn. I have to do the dishes, right? These things have to happen. So I would not be reading these books if I was not listening to them. And so because of that, I add that to the books that I have read, the stories that I have read, because I wouldn't have read them otherwise. I wouldn't know anything about them otherwise because I wouldn't have the time to sit down and read it. But because I have the ability to listen to it as well, I add them to, I now know what has happened in the first 4.5 books of The Wheel of Time. And if you asked me about it, I'd be able to tell you because I was paying attention and I heard what was going on in all of those books.
Yeah. So one of the things that I had been doing too is trying to backlog some of my classics that I somehow missed in my education.
Yeah.
So I'm like, am I going to pick up this book and sit down and read it? Probably not. But, can I turn it on and listen to it? I should. I mean, I did that recently. I listened to War of the Worlds by H.G. That's how you say it. And so that was really good. And actually, it's funny. One thing we talk about is LibriVox productions versus like record. So I started with a LibriVox and I'm like, this is so dry. And then I switched and had a new narrator and I was like, this is a little better. It's a little better. So then I was able to finish it.
Yeah, I had read A Christmas Carol when I was a child. My mom had read it to me actually, so that was again listening. But she had read it to me when I was young, and I thought it would be a fun tradition every November, December. It's not a long book. I'll just listen to it, and so I tried to listen to a LibriVox version of it, and it was it was a little rough, and I said, okay, if I do that again, I'm gonna have to actually buy a good
Right.
copy if I want to read that every year, because I won't be able to listen to it on LibriVox every year.
Nope.
Uh,
Nope. Oh,
yeah,
so and you had said too about reading because that was one thing I want to talk about a little
yeah,
bit. We kind of missed it, but reading to your children is how we teach them how
that's
to
right.
read. And so
That's
that
right.
is something that we've done as a family. And like even when they get old enough to read on their own, they still our son, I don't know if you
Yeah,
remember him pretending like he couldn't read because he wanted us to
yeah,
keep reading to
yeah.
him and
He was afraid that we would stop reading to him if we knew that he could read. Yeah,
yeah. No, but so it's something the kids love. It's something that develops them as people. Um, they remember that time. Just this past Christmas, it was Christmas. We
yeah,
started reading Letters to Father Christmas out loud by
yeah.
J.R. Tolkien, and oh my goodness, it was so fun. And yeah, so it's something that's super important, and it's important for families, I think, especially. It keep brings you together.
I still remember. I was young. I was maybe 7 or 8 years old, maybe even younger, when my dad started to read the space trilogy, C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, to me and to my brother.
Oh
And
my gosh.
we did not make it through book three, but I still remember large chunks of the first two books from that time that it was read to me. I've since read them myself, but
Yeah.
as I was reading them, I was going, "Oh, I remember this." I mean, it was 25 years later, and I still remembered the things that my dad had read to me when I was 7 years old.
Yeah, well, remember I wonder if our daughter will remember me crying through the last few pages. I read to her the Harry Potter series, because we wanted to do it together, and, I when, you know, spoilers, when Harry is going to die, I get cries. Every time I read that, I cry, and so Tim had to take over.
I was gonna say, I think I had to take over for you. Yeah,
And the Wingfeather Saga is another one we read out
that
loud.
was another one.
Oh my goodness. Really hard to read out loud when you're crying. So I always wonder
Yeah,
about, like, these narrators who do such a good job too when they're reading it. I'm like, "You gotta be affected by that and emotional." But you're consummate
it's a hard
professionals.
job, and that's why the good audiobook readers, they have some of the best titles because they're so good at what they do. So yeah, if you have a good reader for an audiobook, I think it's wonderful, and I think go ahead and listen to that book. If you've
Mhm.
got a good reader, listen to that book. Put it on your Goodreads. Just find the audiobook version to put on your Goodreads, so nobody thinks that you're trying to cheat.
I have to go back
But
and change all mine now.
there you go. Yeah. So I think that it counts as reading a story if you're paying attention to it, and if it's being done, especially if it's being done by a good reader, then I think it counts as reading. But I also don't mind you saying, and I do this often in conversation. I will say I read a book, and somebody asks me about it, and I say, well, actually, I listened to it,
Right.
and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with saying, I read a book in passing, but if somebody asks you questions about it, to say, well, yeah, I read it by listening to it. And
Mhm.
so there might be a couple of things that I missed.
Yeah. Yeah, and especially at the speed you listen to books. It's so
I,
fast.
yeah, I tend to listen at 1.5 times speed, but I will slow it down if the reader is a quick reader. I will slow it down. Because I want to listen to it to get the information out of it. I don't want to just get through it. I want to listen to it to get the information out of it. But I tend to be able to hear things very quickly and process them very quickly when I hear them. I process information that way pretty
Mhm.
pretty quickly. So I prefer to have things just read to me because I actually really struggle with reading physical books. It takes me a lot longer to read a physical book than other people.
Mhm.
And I mean, I'm here studying for a doctorate, and I've never been tested, but I'm sure that I have some slight form of dyslexia because there are times where I'll be looking at a word and I cannot understand what this word is supposed to be or how this word fits in the sentence because it's not the word in my head that's on the
Mhm.
paper. And so it takes me a lot longer to read books in physical media than it does to listen, but I process much quicker than probably a lot of other people as they listen to books and as they listen to stories. So I can listen to it and understand it far quicker than I can read it on a page. And so that's probably why I enjoy listening to fun stories, and I will spend the time and the work to read things that are a little bit more technical.
Yeah. Yeah, and Man, I can't listen to that. Like 1.2 times is kind of my max, and even then, I'm like, I didn't even hear anything you said for the last 3 minutes. Now I have to go back, keep hitting that back button. But
Yeah. So ultimately, I don't think that there's a verdict. Keep reading, keep taking in stories, keep
Absolutely.
learning, continue to do that. And I don't think there's a problem with just clarifying the way that you've consumed that media. Whether you say, I was listening to a really good book, there's nothing wrong with that. Nobody should
Yeah.
be judged for that. Or saying, I was reading a really good book. Great. Continue to learn, continue to grow, continue to dive into new stories or to dive into old ones, and to learn them maybe for the first time or maybe afresh. But
Hmm.
continue to learn, continue to deepen your understanding through reading, through listening to books, but keep learning, keep growing.
I like that. Now, so I used to, on my blog, when I had one with WordPress and years ago, I
Yeah.
had a section that I called Audibles, Laudables. And these were audiobooks that I listened to via Audibles and that I wanted to talk about. So I will ask you, what
Hmm.
is your most current laudable audiobook?
Yeah. The most current one that I am listening to is the Wheel of Time series, and um, I have a lot of thoughts on the Wheel of Time series. We don't have time for that tonight, but I do
Another
think
time.
I think if you're a serious reader, if you enjoy, especially if you enjoy fantasy and you haven't read it, I actually really enjoy listening to it. I think that the readers do a great job. It's read really beautifully, and the production is still pretty high, and so it's a really good listen. But there's some issues that I have
Hmm.
with the writing, but maybe more so with the writing than with the recording. So that's what I've been listening to over the last few weeks. I really have not. I haven't listened to anything else really very recently because I've been kind of so
Yeah.
immersed in the world of the Wheel of Time.
Yeah. Good stuff. All right. Well, I think that concludes our episode today.
A little bit of a long one,
A
but
little bit,
yeah,
oh yeah, a little bit long. But all that to say, our verdict is: consume media,
yeah,
consume literature because it comes in all forms, and as always, read rad things. Right. All
that's right.
right. Bye.
Bye.